Thank you for having me. Um, so those who don't know or haven't read the little brief bio, I've been doing blues and jazz and swing dances for the vast majority of my life. Started up at about 6 years old and never really stopped. And that was many decades ago. We don't need to go into how many, but many. So this is titled 100 Years of Social Dance in African American Communities. The title is really more of a suggested framework for the things that I'm currently intending on covering. But as is often the way with things like this, it is best if you ask questions. I want to make sure that you're getting the information that you want, because clearly I know the information that I'm relating to you. And there are things that I think that are important and interesting. And there's the things that you really want to know more about. And I want to make sure that you're all serviced, that you all get the information that you feel is something that has been weighing on your mind, or a question that pops up, even if it means taking a little side journey. So I'm going to try and pop open the group chat every once in a while, because I can only see about half of your faces at a time. But every once in a while, as I'm going through my notes, I will have to not be looking at you or at the chat. So if I miss something, I apologize ahead of time. All right, so starting off, just going to read the group description just real quick, and then very briefly mention some of the popular dances, and we'll get into some more of those as we go. When Africans first landed in what would one day be the United States in the 17th century, much of their culture was stripped from them. In order to survive chattel slavery, the slaves banded together and created a new culture, a blend of those from the various African tribes, as well as what culture they were forced to assimilate. They took their love and hate, their fear and hopes, and created new works of art unique to their new lives. These people created works of art that have been embraced by people from around the world, and much of the Western world's contemporary culture has been influenced by it. In this class, we're going to look at the forms of social dancing that African American communities created, look at some of the more popular forms and what influenced them, and in turn, what new dances they inspired. So some of the dances that you're probably going to be familiar with, and I'm going to leave off the blues dances because this is blues at the Ritzy, so I have a base assumption that you're familiar with a number of those dances by name. So I'm going to talk about some of the other ones, and we will, as is appropriate, talk about some of the blues dances that either directly inspired or were inspired by or helped shape some of these other dances. So things like cakewalk and black bottom, some of the earliest dances. The cakewalk dates back to the days of slavery. Black bottom comes with around the emancipation time period, although it didn't become popular until about the very early 20th century, the early 1900s. Vernacular jazz is a catch-all term, which can actually be used to describe all African-American, or as we tend to refer to ourselves as black dance. Although if we're going to be super particular about it, is directly referencing the idiomatic dances that were created along with and inspired by jazz music and its associated subgenres. Charleston, cakewalk and was the first sort of like global dance craze. And by global, I mean United States, Canada, northern New Mexico, and most of Western Europe. at one point had a real big thing for the cakewalk, and that lasted for a handful of years. But the next big dance craze that swept the world was the Charleston, and that literally went everywhere. There were people that were doing the Charleston throughout various Asian countries, in Australia, throughout all of Europe, Russia, Africa. In the 20s, everybody Charlestoned. And by everybody, I mean various members of each society. There were a lot of very highfalutin, stuffy types that just couldn't be bothered to do the new hot dance. Texas Tommy, which originates in San Francisco, and then travels from San Francisco to the Southwest, to the south of the United States, and then makes its way up north to New York, where it receives a new name called Breakaway. Right around that same time period, Foxtrot starts becoming particularly popular outside of Black communities. Vernon and Irene Castle were a pair of ballroom dancers who built their entire careers on taking Black dance and whitewashing it, removing the problematic Black elements, and then repackaging it, sometimes renaming it, and then selling it to middle and upper class white people. I have a lot of mixed feelings about them. They did a thing that was very popular in the United States, and frankly through most of Western Europe, which is taking they should say Western Europe, a thing popular around the world, where you take a thing by an oppressed people, particularly an ethnic minority, and you remove the parts that make it easily identifiable as belonging to that culture, and then making money off of it, selling it to upper class. You see the same thing with tango. Tango started off in Black Afro-Argentinian ghettos, and it was discovered by Western European dancers and became a massively popular dance in France, particularly a hotbed in Paris, and did not become popular outside of Afro-Argentinian ghettos in Argentina until Parisian dance masters came to Argentina and started teaching, again, the upper middle class that their own dance. The reason why it's conflicted rather than just sort of like curses to you is that they did something that was not very common, which is they paid the Black dancers that they learned from quite well. So rather than just seeing people dance and then trying to copy it and then make stuff up where they weren't sure what was supposed to happen, they actually paid Black dancers, Black choreographers, Black instructors to teach them these dances. And they paid them for their time, and then they went and passed this information on in a way that was palatable to white American tastes. So it's a little bit more complicated than, they stole this thing. They paid for the thing, but they also didn't pass on the credit. So in a lot of cases, the dances that they learned and taught, we know were things that they learned from Black dancers, but we don't know who those Black dancers were. They didn't take that kind of care to pass on that level of information to their own students. So Foxtrot is one of the animal dances that was a rage and incredibly popular. We have Lindy Hop, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. Lindy Hop is a direct descendant of the Texas Tommy by way of breakaway. It actually is a fusion dance. It is multiple dances that have been combined to create something new, different, and unique. The dances being the Texas Tommy / breakaway, Charleston, foxtrot, and a dance called the jig walk. So one of my early formal Lindy Hop instructors was a woman by the name of Norma Miller. She was a famed Lindy Hopper and performer for Whitey's Lindy Hoppers, which was probably the one of, if not the most renowned Lindy Hop performance groups during its time. And when we had decided that we were going to start working together and teaching together, she started teaching me the various parts of the Lindy Hop, the various dances that made it up. And learning the dances in their root form from her was quite an exciting experience, because it was very different than I had come across most of them. The Charleston that she taught me was similar to being the same as the one that I had already learned, but the jig walk I had only known as a single step. The Texas Tommy and breakaway was a thing they had heard of, but had no idea as anything other than a singular move. And the foxtrot that she taught me was just entirely different than what I had learned through ballroom dance classes. So following Lindy Hop, we have a dance that is sometimes talked about as being the dance that killed partner dancing, which is the twist. I have to say that that is not really a true statement. There was partner dancing going on the entire time that the twist was popular, and well after the twist had stopped being popular. But as is frequently the way, there's only so much room for popular things at a given time. So Lindy Hop's popularity waned right about the same time that the popularity of the twist started to increase. And there are a lot of reasons for that. It's easier to dance by yourself than with a partner because you don't need a partner. Lindy Hop was dealing with the fact that right as it was reaching its height, World War II really started cracking down in the United States. So a lot of men who were people who were dancing the Lindy Hop found themselves shipped out of the country, or at least away from home. And it definitely affected the ongoing popularity of the Lindy Hop. Of course, the music started changing as well, and as what had previously been known as rhythm and blues or race music for Black artists and rock and roll for white artists started becoming more and more popular. Lindy Hop was a dance that was not as well suited for the kinds of rhythms that music was using. And so things like the twist were much better suited. And the twist, properly speaking, is really just a modernized version of a couple of different vernacular jazz steps. There's a dance called sand. It is related to soft shoe and tap dancing, but it is more popularly known by the name of its musical impresario, which is James Brown. So if you've ever seen James Brown dance and the shuffling, sliding foot movements that he uses, 90% of that comes from a dance called sand, which is frankly, a much older dance. But Brown popularized the dance and adapted it to fit to his style of music, which was soul and then later became funk. So as solo dances started becoming more and more popular, a lot of people thought that the Lindy Hop died out, and that it didn't get rediscovered and become popular again until the late 80s with the UK's Jive and Lindy Hoppers and Sweden's the Rhythm Hotshots making treks to New York in attempts to discover the roots of Lindy Hop. The reality is that Lindy Hop never died out. The way that they were able to find the original Lindy Hoppers when they came to New York is they found them in clubs where there were black big bands and small combos that were still playing swinging music, and all of these people who were dancing at the Savoy in the 30s, 40s, and very, very early 50s before it closed were still dancing. But they danced Lindy Hop when the music was capital S swing or lowercase s swinging, and very much in the jazz format. But the dance shifted as I said, rhythm and blues became more and more popular. And that created what is collectively known as urban ballroom dancing. And that has a bunch of different dances in it that are still being danced today. Chicago style stepping, Philly bop, Houston two-step, push, whip, and Dallas or Dallas-Fort Worth swing out are all examples of urban ballroom dances that are all direct descendants of Lindy Hop and just altered as the dances matched the new music stylings. Moving back to solo dancing, we have a collection of dances called West Coast Funk. It comes out of the very late 60s to early 70s funk music. It is out of California, mostly in the Bay Area, the Sacramento Valley, and the Central Valley. And that is a collection of dances known as popping, locking, boogaloo. Pretty much all of the dancing that you saw if you watched any black dance shows in the 70s or 80s, particularly if you've seen Soul Train or watched any of the clips online, that is West Coast Funk. The exception to that is when you start getting into the early 80s where breakdancing coming out of New York becomes a thing. Both of those become worldwide phenomena in their own ways. Moonwalk, something popularized by Michael Jackson, but you can see examples of it as early as black and white soundies from the 30s. And with a mix of West Coast funk and breakdancing, we come to hip hop, which is probably more popular than any and all of these dances at their heights, and arguably more popular than any 3 or 4 of them put together. There are dedicated hip hop crews in every country in the planet, and there are massive competitions that happen on a monthly basis with multiple world championships that happen. Hip hop gives rise to things like house, whacking, voguing. And that's a brief, truncated list of African American or Black social dances that have had direct impact in various countries outside of America. Do we have any questions at this point by any chance?
There's a couple of questions in the chat, Damon. Most recently, Anders asks how the hustle fits into this. And Stuart was asking for a bit more clarification around how some of this was problematic.
Okay, so we'll start with the problematic part first. I believe that might have been specifically a reference to Gordon and Irene Castle. So if that was not enough of an explanation, you have a lot of people that saw a thing that seemed novel. And this is really true for each of these dances as they became popular outside of Black America. But most or many of them were not taken seriously. They were things to play with, things that were done for entertainment. They were frequently done in what is called slumming, where you would have people from the white, well-off neighborhoods go to Black neighborhoods and visit their clubs, dance halls, ballrooms, and bars as tourists. They would see what they had to see, and maybe they'd get out on the floor and do their imitations of those dances, or they would take what they saw and alter it so that it was something that they were comfortable with, and they would then dance it in their clubs, in their bars, and in their dance halls and ballrooms, appropriating the dance, removing from it the context, removing from it the values, and the direct immediate connection to its history and its culture. And almost without exception, giving no credit to the originators. So that is how a lot of these things becoming popular outside of Black communities was problematic. It was frequently a case of other people taking these dances, these art forms, and profiting off of them, either via social capital or hard currency, and none of that money making its way back to the originators. Hopefully that helps. So how does the hustle fit into this? The hustle comes in right around the time of James Brown and Urban Ballroom. It is a dance in Black communities that is, again, coming out of the late 60s and into the early 70s. Danced to a derivative of soul and rhythm and blues, which is later known as disco. Disco, like many of these forms of music, is also dealing with a fair amount of the same kind of appropriative issues that we just talked about that were also problematic, where you have white studio executives taking a Black sound, copying it, having it produced by white artists, and then selling it to white communities with little to no acknowledgement of its Black roots, and frankly, almost always being inferior to the original product. And so hustle, the dances fall right in line with that. So you have the line dance of the hustle, and then you have a partner dance which spawned multiple different dances, some of which are directly related with physical alteration, and some of which are not at all related, except that the name hustle is popular. So they took something and added the name hustle to it. In the same way that you're probably aware of, and I know it has a different meaning in the UK, but shag. So you have what? I'm aware. So you have 20, 30 different dances called shag, some of which have Black roots and some of which are Black dances themselves, and many of which are white approximations of Black dances, and a couple that are not related at all, but they just know that the name was really popular and being used for a lot of things, so they called their dance shag also. And it turns the name of a dance into effectively a genre. So when we talk about swing, swing was the music, swing was not the dance. You had a bunch of different dances that one could refer to as a swing dance. But eventually in Los Angeles, they named their version of, I don't want to call it Lindy Hop. They named their version of dancing to swing music just capital S swing. And that mixed with Balboa became Bow Swing, and mixed with Lindy Hop, and then borrowing heavily from Lindy Hop's vocabulary, but removing Lindy Hop's most of the Black aesthetic, although it was an ongoing process, ends up becoming a dance called West Coast Swing.
We have another question in the chat, Damon, but if I could take advantage as the person talking to ask my question as well, which is, I'm interested in what you were saying about the foxtrot earlier, and how what you'd learned from Norma was very different to what you'd learned previously. Could you expand upon that a bit? And then I'll give you Ruby's question from the chat afterwards.
Sure. So when I was in my very early 20s, I took some ballroom dance classes. Just because I had a bunch of friends who did ballroom, and they didn't know the kinds of partner dances that I did, and I didn't know the partner dances that they did. And being a Black man in America, I am used to code switching, setting aside aspects of my own culture in an attempt to fit more seamlessly with the dominant culture. So it was always going to be easier for me to learn their dances, and easier for me to be motivated to do so than it was for them to learn my dances, or to drum up the motivation to do so. And originally it was because people were doing this thing called East Coast Swing, and I just couldn't get it. And it didn't make sense to the music or the movement, and I couldn't figure out why anybody would want to move that way when they had all of these other swing dances that made more sense to the music. So the foxtrot that I learned is part of like American ballroom, which is different than international ballroom. Although foxtrot is pretty much foxtrot regardless of which of the two that you do. It's just sort of like where the emphasis is put, and the training methodology. So I learned foxtrot as a series of moves. There is, your bronze 3 syllabus, and your bronze 2 syllabus, and your bronze 1 syllabus. Now your silver 3 syllabus. And so like that was what I thought of as foxtrot. And as she's teaching me the dances that made up Lindy Hop, she was teaching it to me the same way that I originally learned Lindy Hop, which is I'm gonna put on the music and you're gonna do the thing that makes sense to music. And when you screw it up, I'm gonna make fun of you. Well, I mean, Norma and I had a very specific relationship. I was lucky if the only thing she was doing is like, what is that? How many left feet do you have? Because when it wasn't stuff like that, it was usually corporal punishment. I'm going to hit you until you do the move right. Norma is one of my all-time favorite people, just to be clear. My wife was a professional ballerina, and she learned from the Russian school of ballet. So she and I have tons of stories where we just go back and forth about, oh, well, then I did this step wrong, and then I was forced to do this move, 30 times in a row. And when I was done, I could barely walk. Or I did this thing and my back wasn't in the right place, my arm wasn't in the right place. And, they pulled out the yardstick and swatted me. So, yay. But always done with love and affection, I guess. So anyway, the foxtrot that she was teaching was much more dynamic. It had basic rhythms rather than basic steps. It had improvisation as a core principle. And that was entirely different than the way that it's taught at the lower levels in American ballroom, which is any kind of deviation is just that, deviant. There are no new steps, at least until you get to like gold level, and then you're expected to be able to improvise. Not that you're really taught how to do that up until the point where they just expect you to be able to do it, which is all kinds of problematic, yeah? So the way in which it was taught, the fact that it didn't really use basic steps so much as basic rhythms, were fundamental differences than how I was taught. Also, I was taught it as a line of dance originally, and Norma was teaching it to me as an area dance, which is to say, you can go in a clockwise fashion or counterclockwise fashion, but you can also go here and here and here and here and here. With the caveat is if there are other people who are doing dances that are not this dance, then you do line of dance because you're going around them, and it's just easier and more polite than zigzagging in between. I leave zigzagging in between as my subtle shade throwing when they're doing other dances and I want to do foxtrot or any of the blues line traveling dances, and they won't leave me a track on the outside of the floor. They don't know that that's rude, and they don't know that my zigzagging in between them is rude, but I know, and it makes me feel better. Does that help with how the foxtrot was different?
Yeah, that's there's more I could ask, but there's a bunch of other questions, so I won't hog your time. That was really, really interesting. Thank you.
Cool.
Ruby asks, quite a number of the dances you mentioned are descendants of another, from the dance being adapted, to suit someone, people. Are these all appropriated too? Do all these other dances give credit to the original dancers? It seems to be multi-layered in what is or is not permissible. And then Vivian has a follow-on comment from that, but I'll leave you with that much to answer to first. It's in the chat under Ruby if you want. There's a lot of parts to it, so if you want to have a look.
I am uncomfortable with the word permissible. I can tell you how things were explained to me by my instructors, but that is really a case of like, that thing right there is wrong, and here is why. So there are a lot of wrong ways of doing, any of these dances, but there's not a singular right way. Touching back on foxtrot, that is a fundamental difference from American style ballroom. There is a correct way to do each of these dances. And there are variations of them which are acceptable, but they are all still considered part of the right way. And if you're not doing these set of things, the thing that you're doing is wrong. Again, at least up until you get to gold level, and then the rules soften a little. The dances that come from a people, from a culture, that are idiomatic, which say directly inspired by the music of its day, they are similar in that way. There are some specific things that are wrong and a whole bunch of things that are right. And if it's not wrong and it's not clearly right, then it tends to be your own personal style. If Anna dances a step a certain way, and then Kara dances a step a certain way, and Kelsey dances a step a certain way, and Rosie dances a step a certain way, but it's all the same step, but it's all their own individual styles, or their own individual styles, then if Ryan, Jason, and I watch all of them doing those things, we might be like, oh, that's really cool, but their bodies aren't shaped like ours. We can't do that kind of thing and make it look good the way that they do in their own individual styles. So we try to copy it as best as we can and try and make it work. And as long as we are all part of that same group, that same cultural center, and we're all trying to dance to the same music in that fashion, we are adding to it. We are building the dance from within. And that might mean that this dance becomes like this, with two parts that diverge. And we might end up with two different dances a couple years down the line. This thing here just no longer exists. Everybody shifted to these two different schools of thought. And they might be done to the exact same kind of music. They might be, that deviation might happen because the music itself has started to change. It just depends. The important thing here is to recognize that the difference between appropriation and appreciation in regards to changing dances is whether something happens from within the culture or from without. If I went and saw, Swan Lake and, I don't know, White Knights with Mikhail Baryshnikov, and I'm like, I am now a ballet dancer, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to do this thing called ballet, and I'm going to open, some schools, and I'm going to teach it and make a bunch of money. Hi, Kelsey, I see you shaking your head. I am not. I mean, this is imaginary Damon. Real Damon has a background in ballet, but imaginary Damon has no background in ballet except for having seen this one, this one show and this one movie. That's it. This performance in this movie, and now I'm going to go off and make some stuff up that I think kind of mostly fits into the thing. And I don't really have great this and great that, and I'm not very flexible, and I'm just going to keep doing it. And the places where I'm bad at things, I'm just going to change the rules, or I'm going to eliminate, or I'm going to make the way that I'm bad at it the new rule. If I call that thing, I don't know, Damonosity. Ooh, everybody wants to learn Damonosity. It's the new dance out there. No problem, right? I've been inspired by someone else's art, and I have now created my own art through that inspiration. And if anybody asks, where did you come up with Damonosity? Well, I saw, these, ballet dancers doing these amazing things, and I tried it. And frankly, it was hard and my body didn't like it, but I really liked the idea of the movement. And so I worked really hard to come up with something that felt good in my body, that called to the same things that I really love about ballet. That's appreciation, and that is inspiration and creation of something new. If I decide that this thing is going to be still called ballet, and I'm going to try and make money off of it and teach it, and say that those other things are just, that's just white people's ballet. Like this is Black people. This is modern ballet. This is the way that, this is the cool way of doing ballet. Like that is appropriative. That is failing to give credit. That is failing to learn how to do it properly, but still feeling that I have a right to the name and the history and the cultural import that is all represented by ballet. Dances change, dances evolve, dances die, and dances are born. I don't think that there is any problem acknowledging all of those things as being true. Those are not problematic. The way in which a new dance is created, or who gets credit, and again, social capital, or in some cases, hard currency for the work and development of a dance, has a lot to do whether or not something is appropriation or appreciation. I hope that answered that question. I believe there's a follow-up to Ruby's.
I think that you've answered the follow-up within your answer. To be fair, it's a question around being, I suppose there's a difference between dances that have emerged due to being adapted to a wide audience, e.g. white people, and the dance naturally becoming something different because of the actual social and cultural context. So I think you've already addressed that, unless you'd like to say anything more.
I think the only thing I'd like to talk about is, like I mentioned, SoCal, Southern California swing, and I mentioned West Coast swing as being dances done by white people, and originally inspired by Black music and Black movement. I wouldn't, properly speaking, call either of those appropriated dances. I would say that they are inspired dances. There were a ton of incredibly talented, incredibly skilled, and incredibly dedicated Lindy Hoppers in Southern California, and swing dancers. And West Coast swing is the result of those people dancing to a different style of music in the environment in which they were in. Over the years, the Black influence has been removed, sometimes purely by natural progression, as you would expect when there are so few Black people in West Coast swing. They don't have a connection to the roots of where the music and movement came from. So it's going to naturally deviate. And in some cases, purposeful. A specific and intended change of the aesthetic from the values that are espoused by Black movement, Black culture, and that by white American or white America. So it is what it is. I don't really dance a lot of West Coast swing anymore. It is a dance that I feel has mostly left me. The things that I loved about it in the 90s and early 2000s are harder and harder to find. But I recognize that the dance that it is now is something that has been driven from within the culture, and it'd be inappropriate and appropriative for me to try to force it to be something else.
Thank you. If I could ask a little follow-up to that as well. You were talking about dances in California, which is, I think, where Bal came from. Have I made that up? Could you just mention a little bit about how Balboa fits into some of this stuff?
Isabel's question.
Oh, and Isabel's asking that lower down the line as well, so fantastic.
Great. Understand that my knowledge of Balboa is not extensive. So a lot of what I'm going to be telling you is what I remember from conversations with people like Peter Loggins and Shawnee Brown and Bobby White, Gabby Cook. So if any of those people or any Balboa instructors like contradict me, you should assume that they are correct and I'm misremembering. I want to put that caveat there real quick. I love Balboa. I think it's really cool. Once upon a time, I did it pretty frequently, but that was a couple decades ago. So it is no longer something that I would want anyone to believe that I claim any form of expertise on its history or its execution. Balboa, named after Balboa Island, which is a place down in Southern California. I've heard mixed things about where it originated, whether it was in like the Orange County area, which is south of Los Angeles, versus San Diego. But it's clear that it was very popular from the northern part of like the San Bernardino Valley all the way to the Southern California border with Mexico. I have relatively recently discovered that there were a fair amount of Black Balboa dancers, although most of what we know and pretty much every clip that is passed on is of white dancers. So that's an aspect that I have extracted a promise from a couple of friends of mine, Bobby White and Shawnee Brown, to give me more information at the various points when we are together. So maybe at some point I'll be like, here is the whole thing that I know about Black Balboa, and here's some resources for you to learn about it. But it is a partnered dance that is executed entirely in close embrace. So that's a body-to-body connection. As the dance becomes more popular and as the next generation, and I say that I don't mean the kids of the current dancers, I mean like that next set, the difference between Generation Z and Millennial and Gen X and Boomer, like that kind of time period, as well as like, oh, we've been doing this for the last couple of years, and now there's a new crop of kids who are showing up at this club, or new crop of young adults who are showing up at this bar, and they are taking this dance that we're doing, and they're seeing it, and they're executing it in their way. So as that next generation starts dancing it, it starts breaking out of close embrace. They start adding some turns and some movements that just involve the body separating and then coming back together, separating for some footwork variations and then coming back together. As that progression happens, they start mixing it with the LA style of swing, which it is very similar to Lindy Hop and quite probably inspired by, but rhythmically distinct from. And that started creating really cool turns and extended breakaway movements. I've seen film clips of old timers doing aerials and dips and drops and lifts and stuff like that, all within the context of bow swing. Balboa was a dance that was very versatile and very stylized. A lot, from my understanding, is a lot of what we have today that is that we think of as Balboa really is just a mix of like 2 or 3 leaders and like 2 followers, and specifically the way that they dance. Most frequently, how they danced when they were in their 50s. In the same way that if you think of Lindy Hop and a lot of the people tracing their lineage directly to Frankie, Norma, and Frankie Manning, Norma Miller, and Al Minns, teaching these dances when they were in their 70s and 80s and 90s. But we do have quite exquisite clips of them dancing in their late teens and early 20s. So we have both sides. A lot of what we have for Balboa footage is from the 80s being filmed on, camcorders at like Bobby McGee's, which is a bar down in Southern California.
Thank you, Damon. I'm aware of time. We've got about 7 minutes left, and there's 2 more questions in the chat, which I think we've probably got time to do as well. So thank you for that. The first one's from Cara, which I'm probably going to tag on a little similar question to. Cara says, I learned a 6-count move called jig walk, and I've seen clips of that online. How close is that to the historic jig walk and its influence on cakewalk? And I follow up to that is I was thinking the same when you were talking about the Texas Tommy. I learned that as a Lindy move. And I wondered how that related to the original dance. I'm kind of hoping that the answers to mine and Cara's are similar, but they may not be. There's another question to follow after this.
Yeah, so jig walk traces itself to cakewalk, not the other way around. The step jig walk is a part of that dance. The difference between this answer and the Texas Tommy answer is the step that we think of as a jig walk is not the most dynamic step. It's kind of like, oh, here is a moderately interesting variation on the basic. Versus Texas Tommy is sort of the signature move from that dance. And so if anybody has taken a class with me where I talk about Texas Shuffle, and I make mention about how all the cool dances that have Texas in their name come from California, Texas Tommy is the first of that line. Any other questions?
One more question that's come in, and Isabel follows up with a why. I'm not sure what you're asking why to, Isabel, but Kate has asked, how about Lindy Hop? Are we good enough at recreating it to still call it Lindy Hop?
Oh, that's a really, really loaded question. So a large part of me wants to say some people, but mostly no. The Lindy Hop of today is creatively, artistically, entirely dissimilar from the Lindy Hop of its day, of its height. The mechanical, technical aspects of it, this move and this count and this step are very much the same. It, in a lot of ways, makes me think of tango. So we have what we think of as like ballroom tango, and we have what we think of as Argentinian tango. And the interesting thing is that ballroom tango is actually far more authentic from a technical standpoint. There is every step that you would learn in a ballroom tango class is a legitimate, authentic tango step from 20s and 30s. What you would learn in most Argentinian classes, if you were taught a step at all, is probably not something that you would have ever learned on the dance floor in Argentina in the late teens through, 40s, 50s. But the artistry of ballroom tango, it would be entirely unrecognizable to an Argentinian, to a Black Argentinian at that time period. But if you were to take Argentine tango and were to dance it they would look at it and like, yeah, I get that. I see what you're doing. It makes sense to me. And it's the difference between like, if you learn a language, but you speak it only by taking your native tongue, constructing the sentence that you want, and then translating each word, and then trying to get the grammar correct, and then saying it, it's going to come off stilted and weird. Versus if you learn the language as truly a second language, you pick up the idiomatic phrases, you pick up the slang, you know when you should be rolling an R versus dropping an R, when that R should actually be sounding like an A, although at no point when you're learning the grammar in that language has anybody explained to you, yeah, and sometimes R sounds like an A. You have to live it and breathe it in order to truly understand it. And so Argentinian tango is more closely related spiritually and artistically in that fashion. And our Lindy Hop has that part missing. It is taught as a series of moves. And then you learn some variations. And at some point, when you're an intermediate to intermediate advanced dancer, you start learning musicality beyond the, oh, if I do 3 swing outs and then a Lindy circle, then I'm side by side and I've matched the, the music for the end of the phrase, and now I can do some Charlestons. But if I toss in some 6-count steps, then I have to do this many 6 counts to get back to the top of the one so that I can swing out again with my 8 count so it makes sense. Needless to say, there are Lindy Hoppers out there who feel the music and don't count, ignore counts. And so sometimes they're starting on a 1, and sometimes they're starting on a 3, and sometimes they're starting on a 4. And yet it always works out. It always makes sense with the music. And it's because they're living and breathing it as an improvisational dance versus executing a series of steps that they have learned and mastered, which is where most of the Lindy Hop scene is. I hope I answered that question. I have a playlist of Black dance that I'm going to pop into chat right now. And it is just a bunch of different videos that I would love if anybody who's interested in the idea of like the blues aesthetic or the Black aesthetic or the Africanist aesthetic would take a look at these videos. All of these different African diasporic dances carry the same cultural values. They're not necessarily done in the same proportions or with the same level of priority, but they're all present pretty much all the time. And so seeing these being done in like some of the West African dances that I have here, seeing it done by Jimmy Slide as he's doing his form of tap dancing, that's especially for you, Ryan. Seeing it done by choreographed hip hop dancers and freestyle jazz dancers, seeing it done in Lindy Hop, and being able to compare and contrast things like the posture, how they interact with the rhythm, how they interact with the floor, the use of the aesthetic of cool and ephebism and all of these things that you've probably heard Anna and Ryan and your other instructors talk about as elements of the blues aesthetic. They're all present. And the more that you can train your eye to recognize them in the wider variety of Black dances, the more it can help inform your choices when you're on the floor doing your blues dancing, help you develop your own style, and help blues dance continue to grow and change, but from within the culture, from within the dance, rather than arbitrary changes that are being made from outside of it.
Damon, thank you so much for your time this evening, for sharing your expertise with us, and for answering all of our varied questions. Huge thank you. And thank you as well for being the inspiration for this event being in aid of what it is. So for those of you who may not be aware, this month's Blues at the Ritzy is in aid of Black Lives Matter. Any money that you donate this evening, Damon originally asked last month that his fee for the evening should go towards Black Lives Matter Minnesota. And I kind of ran with that, and the musicians were also keen to support this event. So literally everything that you support, everything that you donate this evening will go towards supporting this incredibly important cause. So I would urge you all, if you are able to, and I appreciate that not everyone is in a position to be able to right now, but if you are able to donate as generously as you can, and the first £500 as well, Blues at the Ritzy will be matching. So it'll kind of effectively double your donation. So if you were thinking of donating at some point, now's a great time. And the way to make the donation is to go through PayPal and make the donation to bluesattheritzy at gmail.com. If you would rather not use PayPal, drop me a PM and I'll give you other ways to make the donation, but that would be the easiest way, please. So thank you, Damon, for the talk, and thank you, Damon, for that inspiration. Go ahead.
Can I say just one quick thing? So Ross had dropped in a link about research with Texas Tommy from Rebecca Strickland. She is actually an old research partner of mine. And we actually did a lot of her initial research on that paper together. So like we went to the place where the dance was created. I actually took her to the site of the original Thalia, which was like the biggest, fanciest ass club in what was called the Barbary Coast of California. So I would definitely encourage anybody who's interested in Texas Tommy reading that paper. She's we started it together, but she's way more of an authority on it than I am. So it's an excellent piece of academic research.
Thank you for that. And I will copy as well the resources that Damon and Ross, and if anyone else has put something into the chat, I'll copy those and pop them into the Blues at the Ritzy event page, so you can find them there after tonight.